So I'm very grateful to those of you who are here with us in the sanctuary and those who are joining us over streaming for the second of our two conversations on Yom Kippur afternoon. I'm delighted to introduce to you my friend Zeke Goldblum. Zeke may be known to some of you if you're old-timers here in Pittsburgh. Zeke's father, Moshe Goldblum, was the rabbi for some 24 years, I believe, at Beth Shalom.
Yes.
Right? And you and your four siblings grew up here on Beacon Street. Mm-hmm. Well, your father was there. And then after you'd finished law school, Zeke, at 26, 27, there were a series of events that led eventually to your being incarcerated for life plus 30 years. You served some 44 years on the charge of murder, right? There's a general consensus that it's clear that that wasn't the crime that you committed. You've been upfront, and we'll give you a chance to share a bit about that which you had done wrong in your own words. Mm-hmm. I remember when the article about your commutation and your release came out in the Jewish Chronicle, you were very clear that you weren't an angel, but you hadn't done that for which you'd been sentenced.
Yeah.
Right? And having gone away at 27 for 44 years, you're now a 72-year-old man. You've had more opportunity than anyone else that I know to reflect on that which you've done, to get a sense of who you are, and to give us some perspective about how we go forward in our lives after having done something that we regret, for which we've perhaps properly been punished or overmuch, but how we deal with ourselves, what we deal with, how we make a sense of forgiveness. And you and I have had a number of conversations in anticipation of this conversation about forgiveness, about how whether we accept forgiveness when someone asks it of us, whether or not we forgive someone else, whether we forgive God, whether we forgive others in the Jewish concept, whether someone has to ask for forgiveness. It's a very complex, deep well of tradition. But I wanted us to focus at least some of our time today, talk about how we forgive ourselves, how we deal with the fact that knowing that we've hurt someone, knowing that we've done something we wish we hadn't done, how we make that right for ourselves.
I don't know that anyone can, well, in my situation anyway, can make it completely right. But you do have to find an accommodation. And it has to be honest. You know, I was listening to you and the Reverend, and you were talking about all we want you to do is listen. I give things maybe more of a lawyer's perspective. I remember a professor, when he would sense that a student was rationalizing or getting too emotional, he would always give him this one refrain that the key to excellence was objectivity, freezing cold objectivity. And that kind of goes with listen, but don't listen with preconceived notions. And I think that you have to, in your mind and in your heart, clear the mess out of the way, and then look at it for what really happened, come to terms with it, and find a way to live with it.
So Judaism teaches, and if you saw in, I think it's yesterday's New York Times, Rabbi David Wolpe from Sinai Temple in Los Angeles wrote a piece, So You've Been Canceled. Here's the title is, So You've Been Canceled, a Yom Kippur Atonement Guide. And he does a nice quick overview of Jewish tradition with regard to forgiveness. And typically, classically, we admit what we've done wrong. Mm-hmm. We go and ask for an apology sincerely. Mm-hmm. And then given the opportunity, we don't sin in that same way again. That's sort of the classic formula. An admission, an apology, and then a commitment to do things differently. Easier said than done, right?
Well, that's true.
It doesn't yet address that, whether or not we owe someone forgiveness who hasn't come asking for forgiveness. Judaism is different than Christian tradition in that regard, with regard to turning the other cheek, or there's an expectation that the person who's done the wrong has a responsibility to go to those persons and ask directly. There's a classic Talmudic teaching which suggests that for sins against God, Yom Kippur atones, but for sins against other people, we have to go to that person and apologize sincerely, right?
Yes. Well, there's a corollary to that also, and that is if someone comes to us and asks for forgiveness, if we don't forgive, then we've sinned against God.
Then the burden shifts, right?
Well, no.
Now we're the one who's carrying the sin, as it were.
Gee, it's so long I don't remember exactly. I'm not sure whether it was a Midrashic rabbi or maybe a Hasidic master. I don't know. But if we didn't forgive, we were sinning against God.
Okay. So now let's talk about for ourselves. Any one of us, and when Zeke and I were planning this, I said, it's very easy. We slip into this all the time to identify someone in the public, in the popular culture, or someone on the political scene, or somebody who's made headlines with their criminality, to point to them, well, this person is a good example of someone who betrayed trust, or this person is a good example of someone who crossed over an ethical line or went too far with this interaction, right? That's relatively easy to identify people in the popular culture who have done that. And it's comfortable because it doesn't require anything of us to pick somebody else out of the lineup and say that person's done something wrong. But given that, we spoke with this before also, that we can convince ourselves of almost anything, each one of us respectively, we can justify our actions, or we feel entitled to the way in which we responded, or we convince ourselves the person had it coming or deserved it, or it's not as bad as someone else had done, so on balance, what I did wasn't much or isn't terribly significant. Given that we can convince ourselves of anything, and we're slow to actually own up to what we've done wrong or who we are in the drama, right? I wonder if you can share with us a bit about how you make that accommodation. What is it to forgive ourselves?
Well, the one thing I don't do is compare. When I was in prison and guys would say, well, he did that. I said, how does that get you off the hook? You have to measure what you did. And
we call that whataboutism, right?
Okay.
I'm accused of this. Well, what about him?
Yeah.
Right? You think this politician is bad? What about the other guy?
Right.
Whataboutism.
Good choice of words.
Right.
I, very early on, really self-reflected. To make a long story short, I had a restaurant that my family owned burned down. And when the arsonist committed a murder, out of fear of him turning me in, I tried to help him cover up, and before I knew it, I was pulled into the murder. And it took many, many years to set the record straight. And why it became so complicated was some of the things that some of the police did, with the missing records and stuff like that. But I put my family through real difficulty. And that's why I said it's not just a matter of forgiving myself, it's knowing what I did to my mom and dad, knowing what I did to my siblings, and the embarrassment I caused them, the embarrassment I caused my former wife. Now, you try to find a way to by, I guess, really being honest with yourself, and you kind of get on with things, but then every once in a while it just forces its way to the front of your mind, and you have to suffer with your mistakes a little bit again. But I think that's okay. I think that's part of the not forgetting completely what you did wrong.
Right.
I can't make that into a formula. I wish I could.
So Rabbi Wolpe addresses in his article that once someone has made repentance, or once someone has apologized, the apology's been accepted, forgiveness has been granted, that it's wrong to go back and remind the person of what they had done, their former life. My mother used to call that gunny sacking. If you hold up all of your grudges and you throw them back at the person at a later date, right? And he talks about that that's not appropriate to do to another. But how often we do it to ourselves is the question, right? How often we remember, or we beat ourselves up, or we want to be honest and sit with what we've done. We don't want to just shrug it off, and we want to find that appropriate accommodation.
I guess I self-gunny sack at times. I would also make a distinction there. If a person seems to be falling back into some of his former mistakes,
yes,
I think a respectful reminder is probably appropriate. I did some peer counseling, and I could tell that there's a certain personality that you find amongst people that had real drug problems, the addictive personality. And when those type of urges would come out in a person, I would take them aside one-on-one and say to them, you're falling back. You're making the same mistakes again. And if you do it as a good friend, if you do it in a constructive way without being berating or condescending, I think that's appropriate.
I was just reminded, a friend shared with me that she now understands that errors, mistakes, the word we use today is sins, can be understood as a failure, and we could beat ourselves up about it. But we can also reframe those mistakes or those errors, even if we repeated them, as a reminder of that which doesn't work for us, that which we don't want to do anymore. Mm-hmm. And so when we are reminded, or we call to mind something we've done in the past whereby we hurt someone, or we did something wrong, or we brought shame, or the rest, that it can serve a productive purpose, but we don't want to stay there or just dwell on the worst part of the worst day of our life.
Well, it's something that I mentioned to you before. To forgive is not to condone. And when the person who has been forgiven starts to lessen the seriousness of his mistake or her mistake, then I think as long as it's done in a constructive, healthy way, then they have to be pulled aside and said, hey, where are you going? What are you doing? I'll be the first to admit that I come from an experience of being around a lot of people that had some real character flaws. I didn't want to live in that kind of environment, but I didn't have a choice either.
Interesting. Rabbi Wolpe in his piece suggests that too often lifetimes are remembered by their worst moments, and complex personalities are reduced to their basest elements. That when we imagine that the person who's done something wrong, or the person who's wronged to us, that's the sum total of who they are, or we find ourselves in a well of depression or self-recrimination where we're convinced that we're the sum total of that which we, given the opportunity, would do differently, that becomes the problem. Whereas Yom Kippur arrives to remind us that we believe in the ability to transform ourselves, to change, to be different, to be better today than yesterday, and better still tomorrow.
You have that element, and I think Rabbi Wolpe might cover some of the other problems where people are forced to make some very difficult choices, where maybe what they're doing is not so much a sin, but it's for the sake of mitigating a prior sin, they have to do something. And in my case, when I went to trial, I did not completely tell the truth about the fire because it would financially imperil my family.
Right.
Well, my family was furious with me when I eventually leveled with them. They said, you should have done that. What did you worry about the money? Well, the whole idea of dragging my mom and dad through financial ruin, I just couldn't do it. And sometimes that happens too. Forgiveness is tricky business. It's complicated. You said a web and a well. It's both. It really is. And you never come out the other end intact. Okay? You just can't. There's damage that's been done, and the best I can say is you have to find a way to live with it. And maybe it's not so much self-forgiveness as it is just finding that accommodation. I don't know, I'm looking for a word.
No, you're doing fine. I'm reminded, Zeke, as we talk, that the word Yom Kippur, Yom means day, and Kippur we usually translate as atonement.
Right.
The first time the word Kippur, or the root of the word, Rabbi Henry was speaking this morning about the root that's shared between mikvah and tikva, right? The ritual bath and hope itself. So Hebrew is built on these roots, and the root for Kippur is kafar, and it appears for the first time in the story of Noah, when that's the material, the kofar is the material with which the hull of the ship is sealed.
Oh, yeah.
So it's a sealant, right? So I think of it as the shoe goo, if you've ever repaired a tennis shoe, or the black squiggly lines down the asphalt of a road that sort of filled in the cracks. It's that kind of goop, right? But as a result of engaging in that act of kafarta b'kofar, sealing it up, or doing that work of atonement, it's patching as opposed to erasing what has happened, right? It's not wiping the slate clean so much as repairing what's been done, and now there's a different pattern, there's more texture. You could argue that it's stronger, the hull of the ship, the surface of the road, the relationships with our most intimate family and friends. When we've erred, we've hurt them, and we've been able to find forgiveness, to seek it, to be granted it, to repair that, the relationship arguably can be stronger, right? So that there's something about going about forgiving, the messy business of forgiveness. It's always there. It's a reminder, right? Our lives are more textured. We're more interesting as a result because we're complex.
Yeah, and it takes time. Even in a family, there were members of my family that took years to find their way to, they didn't totally forgive me, but we came to some kind of friendly understanding. I don't know if that's
Yeah, I think that's a term of art, a friendly understanding within a family.
Yeah.
Right? We're going to agree to disagree, or we're going to love each other in spite of the fact that I don't like you right now.
Well, sometimes you don't want to delve into it. One sibling kind of really abandoned me for a while, and when that sibling brought it up and started to come around and brought it up on a visit, he wanted to explain, and I said, we're both old. Why don't we just leave it alone and never bring it up again? And that was my way of keeping it. Yeah, I just felt at that moment that if we started getting into all the ins and outs and this and that it was just going to open up old wounds.
Right.
And so for us, in that situation, it was just best to ignore it and start over.
So what I take from that example, Zeke, is that while there are sort of a prescription for forgiveness in Jewish tradition, it's not formulaic, right? It's not cookie cutter. Certainly families aren't, individuals aren't, but these circumstances, right? Even if that which took place in my family is the same thing as took place in your family, the families are idiosyncratically different. And so there's no one single formula for how to go back repairing relationships, right?
Yeah.
It takes time. There has to be an accommodation and an acceptance that we're not the sum total of who we are on our best day or our worst.
Yeah, I had other people contact me after I got out, and they admitted to me that they weren't sure if I was innocent, but then when they saw the evidence, they wanted to apologize. And I always said to them, let's just forget that. Let's just take what's left and do what we can with that. And I just kind of felt like I wanted to put all of that behind me, and I didn't want to delve into it any more than I absolutely had to.
Right. Well, that's about not. It's about not defining the relationship exclusively on that event.
Yeah,
right.
That's a good way to say it. Maybe my wanting to forgive, and I really do forgive those who doubted me. My wanting to forgive was, and again, you say there's no cookie cutter. I knew that I wasn't an angel.
Right.
And if they can look past the fact that, yeah, I engaged in arson, well, then I can look past the fact that maybe they thought I did something worse. So, you know, but again, maybe that doesn't work for someone else.
Well, I'll tell you that when I first read your story, before we were introduced by a mutual friend,
Right.
I was struck by your willingness to upfront concede I wasn't an angel. I did many bad things, right? I'm responsible for the actions that I performed.
Yeah.
Right? And yet, just the same, that need not be the sole definition of who I am, and it need not define every relationship that I had, continue, or that I enter into.
I think that we were going to basically talk about self-forgiveness here, but I think what makes it easier to come to an accommodation with yourself concerning your own mistakes is by convincing yourself that you have to be generous with others.
Generous with others.
Yes, I think it's absolutely essential. The one thing I did for the past several years in prison, and I even do it now in the halfway house, if I see someone is really destitute, I don't, just open my pockets with everything, but I will try to, a lot of guys come out without clothing, so I'll go down to the store and buy a pair of jeans or something. And maybe it's part of my atonement, I don't know. But...
and what does that do for you, Zeke? Why do you do that? To help them, but I suspect that somehow it helps you also.
Oh, sure. Oh, yeah, I'll be the first to admit that there's got to be some kind of selfish motive that I'm trying to, it's part of my atonement. And it's also a recognition on my part that I'm fortunate that I had so much support from my family.
Right.
And that I had such good friends that never lost faith in me and helped me out in so many ways. So I felt that it's like that movie, Pay It Forward, I guess.
Right.
I always liked that movie. The poor young boy dies in the end.
Yes. Yeah. I'm thinking that the connection between a spirit of generosity, an awareness that you have more than you require, or any one of us has more than we require, and being focused on others. Think of how often generosity and gratitude, and they go hand in hand, I think, is part of being able to get through a difficult time, a time of self-absorption, whether it's a depression, whether it's an incarceration, whether it's a breakup, whether it's, you find yourself where you're very much self-absorbed, and that being grateful for what you have, generous towards others, extending yourself towards others is a essential way of getting out of oneself.
Yeah, I guess it's also a way to change the subject away from self.
That's right. or reminding ourselves that we have this good impulse also, right? Yes, I can be selfish. I can be, and I know what it feels like to be generous. And so by doing that, I remind myself that I'm not exclusively a self-absorbed person. I'm that, and I'm aware of what my responsibility is.
Well, I'll be the first to admit that we all have to a certain extent, be a little self-absorbed. We have to take care of ourselves. But I think if we wear blinders as to what's going on around us, that's not good either.
Well, and I'm wondering if being concerned about others is, in point of fact, a way of taking care of ourselves. If we're only about other people, right, and we neglect ourselves, that's too much of a good thing, arguably, yes? But that we help ourselves by helping others, or by forgiving others, or being open-hearted and generous with others, giving them a bit of grace or the benefit of the doubt. Perhaps we'll learn something, right? We get good at what we practice.
Yeah. And you have to be careful about who you help.
Say more about that.
Well, again, it's very fact intensive. If there are guys that are coming in and just ask to borrow and you know they're going to use it to go buy drugs, no. But there are guys who don't have family, and they come in, and one guy came in, and he was a very big, tall guy, and they didn't have clothing that fit him. And I didn't even say anything to him. I went down to the Burlington, and I saw a pair of pants that I knew he could use. So I bought them. And I just put them on his back. He later figured out that it was me, but I just put them on there, you know, because I just felt that a guy shouldn't be walking around with one shirt and one pair of pants, you know. But, and I'm not completely sure what exactly my motivations were. I don't really classify them, you know. You just have these sense that I really ought to do something here.
Zeke, I'm thinking, and I'm sure there's a lot of curiosity in the room about what an individual thinks about, or how one thinks of themselves after 4+ decades locked up. That for many, we spoke, you and I, that there was a distinction between the sentence one receives, the punishment one receives, the shame or rebuke or the sullied reputation. Mm-hmm. People have imaginings in their mind. They didn't believe you. They think that, well, you're just a crook, or whatever it may be. And then the responsibility that we have to ourselves, right? I keep coming back to that. There's the sentence that will be on the record. There's the way in which people perceive you, and then there's our own estimation of self.
Well, that's where I hurt myself. I think the first 10 years I was in prison, that there was something inside me that said, well, you know, I deserve to be here, and I didn't help my lawyers as much as I should have. I was naive also. I really felt that once we showed the truth of what happened, that the people in the police and the prosecutors would be more ethical than they turned out to be. And that's a whole problem of forgiveness too. It really doesn't matter now. Most of them have passed away, so right. I don't have to think about it. But
you got caught up in a system, and you were done wrong, right? You had done things wrong, but you also were on the receiving end of some injustice.
But I didn't take it personally. Being a lawyer, I knew how to analyze this stuff, and I've seen it done to other people. There's just, you know, lawyers have that same refrain as doctors, do no harm. But those lawyers that practice that have a client. Prosecutors really don't have a client. They just want to put notches in their gun belt. Many of this. Let me recharacterize that. I would say that a majority of them, not a big majority, maybe 60–70%, are straight shooters. But there's enough of them, especially the career ones, that they're shooting for judgeships, and they don't have as much conscience as they really should have, and they don't confess error. Mm-hmm. And I don't think they had it out for me. I really don't, because I've seen them do this to other people. Mm-hmm. So, and I don't know what the remedy is either. I don't know what could be done to the system to make it better. But it would have to be a substantial reform. I think electing prosecutors is probably not a really good idea. Let me leave it at that.
You know, I'm thinking that we use the metaphor of a courtroom in Yom Kippur liturgy, right? We say about God. We say you're judge and arbiter, you're witness and counsel, and we stand before you, ready to be sentenced, or right. We're confessing it all, and we hope to be forgiven or released this year. You know, that's the imagery we use, the idea being that our actions have consequence and we're responsible for how we behave, right? And then we know there are bad actors out there, right? Or there are bad things that happen, or someone can do something to us that's unforeseen, and our life goes in a very different direction. I want to come back again, though, to what it means to truly be willing to forgive ourselves, or what's required in order to do that. How we move beyond the nagging sense or the self-flagellation that we may find ourselves engaged in if we know we've hurt someone else, intentionally or unintentionally, but as a consequence of our actions.
Sometimes failure to forgive, and in my case, I guess I didn't forgive the prosecutor, and I felt he wasn't being honest. He tried to come forward and just say, well, now that I looked it over again, I think he's innocent. But he left crumbs in the transcript where you could tell that he knew all along. And he wanted to actually represent me.
The prosecutor eventually wanted to represent you.
Well, he had lost his law license and he wanted to get it back and represent me. And I was too hard on him. I said to him, I need you to come clean completely.
Uh-huh.
And maybe I shouldn't have done that. Uh-huh. It was a very interesting dynamic between my mother and my father. My mother agreed with me, and my father said, you're being too hard on him. And he tried to go a little further, and then I lost contact with him and he passed away. Mm-hmm. And that's part of what plagues my conscience. Sometimes I think that I was just taking it out on him. Mm-hmm. So I guess that's one more thing I got to live with.
Well, I think that we all have those things we have to live with, and it's so interesting what captures our own attention, right? One might, having heard a bit of your story, would be surprised to know that that's what weighs on your mind, as opposed to any number of other things that one might imagine, right? But you're not having given someone the benefit of the doubt or being too harsh on them, right? And I suspect that, I know that in my case, when I'm hard on myself for having done something that, given the opportunity to do differently, I would certainly seize the opportunity to do it differently. I think that for me, the issue is that the gap between knowing what I should have done and what actually took place, or knowing I was capable of doing it better, and I didn't choose to, or I gave in to the impulse, or I felt justified or self-righteous, or whatever the number of things are that I can then justify in other ways. But that's what, for me, plagues my conscience, right? When I know that gap I didn't choose to traverse, or I could have done better and I didn't. And living with that, I think, is part of what we learn it means to be a human being. You live long enough and you have some of those scars, some of that friction, some of those...
They're scars, all right, yeah. They definitely are.
I know that one of my favorite quotes is from the poet Rainier Maria Rilke. And Rilke speaks of what we can offer one another and where that comes from. The quote is as follows: "Do not believe that he who seeks to comfort you lives untroubled among the quiet and simple words that sometimes do you good. His life has much difficulty. Were it otherwise, he would never have been able to find the words." Mm-hmm. The idea being that we don't have to have had the exact same experience as somebody else to appreciate what it means for someone to experience heartache. We don't have to have had the same experience as someone in order to know what it is to suffer our own self-recriminations. We don't need to have had whatever the experience might have been, in order to be able to be present with another person, to give them the benefit of the doubt, as Dr. Lee was saying, to listen to their story, to be with the one who is sad, to stay there. But when we fail to do that, even in the most simple of ways, well, that's when we know that we've deviated from what we're capable of. We're not really being present with another person or with ourselves, perhaps.
Yeah, I think that it's just part of the being human that we do try to mitigate our mistakes. We make excuses, and that's why we have to go through the vidui every year, you know.
Right. It's why we say last year the confession came easily to our lips, right? This year will it be more than simply words? Are we willing to do the hard work, the uncomfortable work,
Yeah.
right? Of sitting with ourselves, with our conscience, listening, and then figuring out how we go back and approach those persons to repair, or just do differently going forward. This prosecutor, you can't do right by him or give him the benefit. Oh, he's passed away. So what do you do going forward? How do we continue to live in a way that best reflects our ideals, in spite of the fact that we're not perfect and we can't claim any longer to be perfect?
Yeah. Well,
This is the first Yom Kippur since in 45 years, right? That you've been able
44, yeah.
44 years that you've been able to attend services or be wherever you wanted to be with your thoughts at that time. I wonder what this day and the opportunities going forward, as you look into the future, present for you. What does this day mean?
Magnificent.
It's magnificent.
It really is. To be in a beautiful sanctuary like this, you know, it's renewed hope for me.
It's really very beautiful. I mean, in some ways, metaphorically, only metaphorically, that's the idea of this day for all of us, right? That we can each be released, if you will, from the shackles that have us tied to whatever it was, the earlier behavior or the earlier ideas or the justifications or rationalizations that we engaged in just yesterday. But the idea that this day provides us an opportunity to be reflective, to be responsive, to be reactive, and to do better tomorrow in the year ahead.
I think that's why I was so, in my application, that's why and in a book, I really felt that no more excuses.
Your application is explained for commutation.
When you try to have your sentence commuted, you initially apply to the Board of Pardons, and if they recommend you, it goes to the governor. And the applications that you fill out, you have to give a pretty extensive history of the case. And through doing that over the years, I felt that I had to be completely honest, and I had to be as hard on myself as I would be on someone else.
That cold objectivity you spoke of earlier.
Yeah, the freezing cold. Yeah,
Freezing
Professor
cold.
Murphy at law school. But what's interesting is he asked me. He came to see me.
Murphy?
No, not the Dixon, the prosecutor.
Uh-huh.
He came to visit me a few times, and he said to me two things that, you know, I could tell he was going into his lawyer bag. He said, "Why did you lay it all out like that? Why were you so hard on yourself?" And I tried to explain to him why I felt that I needed to do that. Maybe it was my confessional, you know, I don't know. And he said, "But you're asking too much of me." And so I actually pointed out to him, I did it in a friendly way. I wasn't angry. I just said, "Look, you said this when you talked to the jury. It has to mean that you knew." This dealt with the mental state of the guy who testified against me. I don't want to get into all the particulars. And he said, "Well, that's just something I picked up on." I said, "Come on." And at that point, he just kind of went like this. because he wanted me to write a letter of support for him to get his license back.
I see.
And I said, I can't do it. He said, you need to openly admit that I suborned perjury. I said, yeah. And then, I don't know, he fell apart. And I blame myself for that a little bit. Yeah, I know, that's what my mom said. A blessed memory. I mean, I didn't do it in a harsh way with him. I said, but you got to come clean the same way I did. And I don't know if that's a lack of forgiveness or not. I don't know what I was thinking at that point.
You know, I'll wrap up. Our time is
I'm sorry.
No, you're doing great. There's a lot to unpack here. Thinking of the Talmudic teaching, which suggests that the sinner who repents is more righteous than the one who's never sinned, as if there's someone who's never sinned. But the idea of having done something wrong, having recognized it, owned up to it, and resolved to not do it going forward, that's harder work than the rectitude required to never do wrong.
That's midrash, isn't it?
That's midrash.
Yeah.
And it's really sort of a wonderful idea that this process of forgiveness is not a once and done kind of activity, nor is it something that we should wait till one day in the year, Yom Kippur, to do, but that it is part and parcel with the process of growth, maturation, and living a life, right? Certainly living a life with others.
Yeah. Well, I would also say that it's given me a comfort level by just making my life an open book. No secrets. This is what I did. These are the mistakes that I made. You find a comfort level that there is nothing left to worry about because it's all out there.
And we needn't do that publicly, but we need to do it per Yom Kippur's admonitions for ourselves.
Well, you know, I didn't realize it's like, you have a wonderful machzor, by the way. And if you look at the structure of the vidui, it starts off that way, but it ends up with Ki anu amecha, but we are your people.
Right, right.
But we become God's people by really coming clean.
Well, that's the promise that's held out for today, that if we do the difficult work of the cheshbon hanefesh, the accounting of our own souls, right, to whom we owe that to no one but ourselves, although others may benefit from it, then we find that Ki anu amecha, that we draw closer to God. Zeke, I want to thank you for sharing part of this afternoon.
Thank you for having me.
Really a pleasure.
Thank you.
Wish you continued successes, and look forward to sharing much more time together.